Jinsu Park commanded respect with a single glance. From a cramped studio apartment in Seoul to the top floor of Chicago's most exclusive tower, his rise had been meteoric and merciless. 20 years of calculated risks, strategic alliances, and decisions that kept him awake at night had built an empire that stretched across 3 states. Politicians returned his calls within minutes. Business rivals learned quickly that challenging him meant losing everything. His name alone opened doors that remained locked to others, yet on this December evening, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city draped in holiday lights, Jinsu sat in complete darkness, a glass of aged whiskey untouched beside him. The silence in his penthouse was absolute, broken only by the occasional siren far below. No music played. No television flickered with mindless entertainment. No voices called out greetings or asked about his day. At 42 years old, Jinsu had achieved every goal he'd set when he'd arrived in America with nothing but fierce determination and his mother's blessing. The luxury surrounding him, Italian leather furniture, original artwork worth small fortunes, technology that anticipated his every need, felt hollow. Success had demanded sacrifices he'd made without hesitation, but the cost had become painfully clear. His mother's funeral in Seoul had happened without him, business obligations keeping him an ocean away. His younger brother had stopped reaching out after years of unanswered messages, disappointed by what his once idealistic sibling had become. Women drifted through his life with predictable regularity, drawn by power and wealth rather than genuine connection. They left with expensive gifts and carefully worded non-disclosure agreements, never staying long enough to see beyond the carefully constructed facade. His associates feared him too deeply for friendship, their loyalty purchased rather than earned. Even his most trusted lieutenant maintained a professional distance that never crossed into personal territory. Jinsu had constructed walls so high and thick that no one could reach him, and now he was trapped behind them, master of an empire but prisoner of his own design. Christmas had never held particular meaning for him. Growing up Buddhist in Seoul, the holiday had been a Western curiosity, something observed in movies and television shows but never personally experienced. Yet watching Chicago transform into a winter wonderland, lights strung across every street, trees glittering in windows, families bundled together against the cold, stirred something unexpected. The joy radiating from strangers, the warmth of shared traditions, the simple pleasure of belonging to something larger than oneself, all of it highlighted the emptiness of his existence. He'd convinced himself that solitude was strength, that needing others was weakness. Now, surrounded by evidence of his success, he wondered if he'd been catastrophically wrong. The whiskey remained untouched as Jinsu stared out at the city below, watching lives unfold in illuminated windows. Families gathering for dinner. Couples walking hand in hand through snow-dusted streets. Children pressing their faces against glass, searching the sky for Santa's sleigh. He owned properties worth millions, controlled operations that generated wealth beyond imagination, wielded influence that could destroy careers with a phone call. But he couldn't buy what those strangers had: connection, purpose, love. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more deals, more calculated moves in the endless chess game of his profession. Tonight, however, Jinsu allowed himself to feel the weight of his isolation, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. The restaurant on North Wells Street represented Jinsu's attempt at legitimate enterprise, a high-end establishment where Chicago's elite gathered to be seen and impressed. He visited quarterly to review finances and observe operations, preferring late evenings when the controlled chaos of service revealed inefficiencies that daytime inspections missed. The holiday season brought peak business, reservation lists stretching weeks ahead, tables filled with celebration and laughter, servers navigating the crowded space with choreographed precision. Jinsu occupied his usual corner table, half hidden in shadows, watching money flow through his establishment while nursing scotch that cost more per ounce than his servers earned per hour. Movement caught his attention, a server weaving through the dining room with practiced grace despite obvious exhaustion. She balanced multiple plates effortlessly, her smile never faltering even as fatigue shadowed her eyes. Something about her presence stood out from the other staff members, a warmth that seemed genuine rather than professionally manufactured. Jinsu noticed how she checked her phone between tables, how tension tightened her shoulders each time the screen lit up, how worry flickered across her features before she smoothed it away. Her name badge read Maya Johnson, but he'd never paid attention to individual employees before, treating them as interchangeable parts of a profit-generating machine. Tonight, something compelled him to look closer. When Maya approached his table, her professional demeanor never wavered despite whatever personal crisis clearly occupied her thoughts. Her voice carried the melodic cadence of the South Side, softened by exhaustion or perhaps innate gentleness. Jinsu found himself studying her face, the way concern etched fine lines around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the carefully maintained composure that threatened to crack. She took his order efficiently, but her phone buzzed again, and this time the fear that flashed across her features was unmistakable. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the device, reading a message that visibly shook her. Jinsu surprised himself by asking if something was wrong, words escaping before professional distance could stop them. The question clearly caught Maya off guard, professional mask slipping momentarily before reasserting itself. She assured him everything was fine, apologizing for any perceived disruption to his experience. But her eyes told a different story, one of desperation barely contained, of a mother's fear for her child, of poverty's cruel mathematics. Jinsu watched her retreat toward the kitchen, watched her shoulders shake with silent sobs just outside his line of sight, watched her take several steadying breaths before returning to work. Something fundamental shifted in his chest, a crack forming in walls he'd spent 2 decades constructing. He'd built his empire by ignoring other struggles, by viewing human suffering as background noise to his ambitions. Now, faced with one woman's quiet anguish, he couldn't look away. Following Maya to the staff area violated every boundary he'd established, yet Jinsu found himself moving before conscious decision occurred. He caught fragments of her phone conversation, a desperate mother promising her daughter she'd come home soon, voice breaking on reassurances about medicine they couldn't afford, love expressed through tears and inadequate words. When the call ended, Maya's composure shattered completely, grief and fear pouring out in the mistaken privacy of the corridor. Jinsu cleared his throat, and she spun around with mortification flooding her features, immediately apologizing and promising her personal crisis wouldn't affect her performance. But he'd heard enough, seen enough, felt something crack open inside him that couldn't be sealed shut again. The question he asked next, about her daughter's medication cost, would redirect his life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Maya's pride warred with maternal desperation across her face, shame and fear creating visible tension as she tried to deflect his questions. She insisted everything was manageable, that her daughter's asthma was controlled, that she didn't need charity from anyone, especially not from her wealthy employer. But Jinsu recognized the lie for what it was, protective armor worn by someone who'd learned that asking for help meant disappointment. He'd worn similar armor himself, though forged from different circumstances. Her daughter needed an inhaler she couldn't afford until her next paycheck, rent and Christmas presents having consumed funds meant for emergencies. $300 stood between a child breathing easily and dangerous respiratory distress, an amount Jinsu had spent on lunch without thinking, but which represented an insurmountable obstacle for the woman before him. The decision came instantly, bypassing the careful calculation that governed Jinsu's every move. He ordered Maya to take Christmas Eve off, paid, and retrieve her daughter's medication immediately. Her protests came automatically, reminding him of the restaurant's busiest night, of her colleagues who'd be shorthand, of her employer's expectations. Jinsu cut through her objections with quiet authority, reminding her that he owned the establishment and could make any staffing decision he deemed necessary. Then he withdrew $500 bills from his wallet, pressing them into her reluctant hands despite her repeated refusals. The money was for her daughter, not a loan to be repaid, not charity with strings attached, simply a father figure ensuring a child's well-being. Something about his certainty, his refusal to negotiate or discuss repayment, finally broke through Maya's resistance. She stared at the money as if it might disappear, then looked up at Jinsu with confusion mixing with desperate gratitude. Her question hung between them. Why would he do this for a stranger's child? Jinsu couldn't articulate an answer that made sense even to himself. Perhaps because the amount meant nothing to him but everything to her. Perhaps because for once he could use his wealth for something purely good, untainted by strategic calculation. Perhaps because seeing a mother's anguish reminded him of his own mother's sacrifices, opportunities he'd squandered in pursuit of power and respect. He simply stated that her daughter needed medication, and he had the means to provide it. The mathematics were elementary, the decision obvious, though Maya's expression suggested such straightforward kindness was anything but obvious in her experience. When Maya left, moving quickly as if afraid he'd reconsider, Jinsu returned to his corner table with scotch that suddenly tasted less bitter. He told himself this was a momentary impulse, that by tomorrow he'd have forgotten the waitress and her sick daughter, that normalcy would reassert itself with morning light. But something had fundamentally shifted, a door opening in his carefully constructed emotional fortress. That night, alone in his penthouse with Chicago glittering below, Jinsu found himself thinking not about business opportunities or strategic maneuvers but about a woman's fierce love for her child, about dignity maintained despite crushing poverty, about the fierce determination in Maya's eyes even as tears fell. Sleep came eventually, but his dreams were haunted by questions he'd never asked himself before. Christmas Eve morning arrived with fresh snow transforming Chicago into a postcard-perfect winter scene. Jinsu had scheduled the day like any other: conference calls with overseas contacts, document review for pending acquisitions, strategic planning for the new year. But concentration proved elusive, his mind wandering to the south side where little girl was finally breathing easily thanks to medication her mother could suddenly afford. He told himself checking on them would be inappropriate, that his involvement ended with yesterday's gesture, that inserting himself further into their lives served no purpose. Yet by afternoon, Jinsu found himself in his car driving south rather than north, away from his sterile penthouse toward neighborhoods where his Mercedes drew attention for all the wrong reasons. He invented excuses, checking on other properties, inspecting potential investments, anything except admitting the truth. He wanted to see if his money had made a difference, wanted to witness the outcome of choosing compassion over indifference for once in his meticulously calculated life. The pharmacy on 71st Street was crowded with last-minute shoppers scrambling for forgotten items and emergency purchases. Jinsu stood out dramatically: designer overcoat, expensive watch, the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to deference and respect. Several customers did double takes, clearly wondering what brought such obvious wealth to their working-class neighborhood. He considered leaving before anyone recognized him, before this impulsive decision could be analyzed and judged. Then he spotted Maya at the prescription counter with a small girl tucked protectively against her side, and all thoughts of retreat evaporated. The child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wheezed softly despite clutching a pharmacy bag that presumably contained her new inhaler. She wore a coat inadequate for Chicago's brutal winter, but her eyes sparkled with innocent joy as she hugged a small stuffed animal, clearly a Christmas present bought with money that should have gone elsewhere. Jinsu approached before conscious decision could stop him, startling both Maya and her daughter with his sudden appearance. Maya's eyes widened with recognition and surprise, clearly wondering what her employer was doing in her neighborhood pharmacy on Christmas Eve. Her daughter stared up at him with open curiosity, lacking the wariness that experience would eventually teach her about powerful strangers. Jinsu invented another transparent lie about business in the area, about stopping for coffee before heading home. The little girl, whose name he learned was Arya, immediately perked up at the mention of coffee, asking if that meant hot chocolate too, because hot chocolate on Christmas Eve was essential according to her firmly held beliefs. Her mother started to refuse, but Jinsu found himself crouching to the child's level, something he'd never done before, agreeing that Christmas Eve absolutely required hot chocolate as a fundamental rule of the holiday season. The cafe across the street was warm and festive, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of colored lights that reflected off fogged windows. They claimed a corner booth, and Jinsu ordered hot chocolate for Arya, coffee for himself and Maya, suddenly uncertain why he'd inserted himself into their Christmas Eve plans. Arya filled the awkward silence with constant chatter about school and friends and everything she wanted to be when she grew up: astronaut, veterinarian, artist, possibly all three simultaneously. Her enthusiasm was infectious, pulling reluctant smiles from Jinsu despite his discomfort with children and casual conversation. Maya watched the interaction with cautious warmth, clearly torn between gratitude for his help and suspicion about his motives. When their drinks arrived, Arya declared it the best hot chocolate in the entire history of the world, her dramatic pronouncement making even Jinsu laugh genuinely for the first time in months. Conversation flowed more easily than Jinsu expected, Maya sharing carefully edited versions of their holiday plans: dinner at home, classic movies, presents opened Christmas morning. Arya added enthusiastic details about the bicycle she wasn't supposed to know about, then covered her mouth in exaggerated horror at spoiling the surprise. The easy affection between mother and daughter was foreign territory for Jinsu, who couldn't remember the last time anyone had touched him with such casual love or teased him with such comfortable familiarity. When Maya asked about his Christmas plans, his honest answer, working alone as always, fell into sudden silence. Arya's face scrunched with childish concern, asking why he didn't have family to celebrate with, her innocent question striking directly at the heart of his carefully maintained isolation. Before Maya could scold her daughter for inappropriate curiosity, Arya announced with absolute certainty that Jinsu should spend Christmas with them, because nobody should be lonely on Christmas, and they had plenty of room and love even if dinner was just chicken because turkey cost too much. The invitation hung in the air, shocking all three of them. Maya looked mortified, immediately apologizing for her daughter's forwardness, explaining that Arya didn't understand social boundaries or professional relationships. But Jinsu found himself accepting before his logical mind could construct appropriate refusals. The words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised Maya. Yes, he would love to join them for Christmas if the invitation was genuine, if his presence wouldn't disrupt their family traditions. Arya's delighted squeal answered that question definitively, her joy so pure and unfiltered that something in Jinsu's chest tightened painfully. Maya still looked dazed, clearly questioning whether Chicago's most powerful Korean businessman had actually agreed to spend Christmas in her modest South Side apartment. Jinsu confirmed his acceptance, wondering what compulsion had driven him to say yes, what desperate loneliness had made a stranger's invitation feel like salvation rather than awkward obligation. But when Arya beamed at him with absolute trust and happiness, calling this the best Christmas ever before it had even started, Jinsu knew he'd made the right choice for reasons he couldn't quite explain. Christmas morning arrived with snow falling gently over Chicago, transforming even rough neighborhoods into something magical and clean. Jinsu stood outside the 3-story building in Bronzeville, expensive wine and an enormous gift bag in hand, questioning every decision that had led to this moment. He'd negotiated with dangerous men without hesitation, closed deals worth millions without breaking concentration, built an empire through calculated risk and strategic thinking. But climbing these worn stairs to a stranger's apartment made his heart race with anxiety completely foreign to his usual experience. Before doubt could drive him back to his car, the door flew open and Arya launched herself at his legs with complete absence of self-preservation instinct, shrieking that he'd actually come, that she'd been worried he might change his mind, that this was definitely going to be the best Christmas in the history of Christmas. Maya appeared in the doorway looking younger and softer than she did at work, wearing jeans and a green sweater that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Her natural hair framed her face in beautiful coils, and her smile carried genuine pleasure mixed with lingering disbelief that he'd actually shown up. She gently extracted her daughter from his legs while apologizing for the enthusiastic greeting, inviting him inside with a shy gesture that suggested she still couldn't quite believe this was happening. Jinsu stepped into an apartment that couldn't have contrasted more sharply with his sterile penthouse. Tiny living space, modest furniture, and a small artificial tree in the corner covered in homemade ornaments and dollar store decorations. But warmth permeated every corner, the scent of cooking food filling the air with promise, and Jinsu felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This place, worth a fraction of his penthouse, felt infinitely more like home. He offered Maya the wine and handed Arya the gift bag, watching her eyes grow impossibly wide as she pulled out a professional quality art set, new winter coat in her size, and a stuffed animal nearly as large as she was. Her delighted squeal could probably be heard throughout the building, and Maya looked torn between gratitude and concern that the gifts were too expensive. Jinsu insisted it was simply Christmas, nothing more, though they both knew these presents cost more than Maya earned in 2 weeks. Arya declared him the best gift giver ever and insisted on introducing him to all her other toys, dragging him by the hand to show him treasures that probably came from thrift stores but which she treated like priceless artifacts. Her complete trust, her lack of calculation or hidden agenda, was more disarming than any business negotiation Jinsu had ever experienced. Dinner preparation became a group effort, with Jinsu finding himself in Maya's tiny kitchen learning to make collard greens and cornbread under her patient instruction. They worked in close quarters, accidental touches sending unexpected electricity through him, her laughter at his culinary incompetence warming something frozen inside his chest. She shared stories about her late husband Marcus, a construction worker who died in an accident 4 years ago, leaving her to raise Arya alone on a server's wages. Jinsu talked about his mother in Seoul, about arriving in America with almost nothing, about the sister he'd lost contact with through years of single-minded ambition. The conversation flowed naturally, vulnerability shared without calculation, two people discovering common ground across vast differences in circumstance and experience. Arya provided constant entertainment from the living room, singing off-key and narrating elaborate games with her new toys. The meal was simple but delicious: roasted chicken, sides prepared with care, store-bought rolls warmed in the oven. They sat together at the small table, Arya chattering between bites about school and friends and all her plans for the future. Jinsu couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal that wasn't a business obligation, where laughter came easily and conversation flowed without hidden agendas. When Arya asked why he didn't have children of his own, suggesting he'd make a good father because he was kind and gave excellent gifts, something in Jinsu cracked open. He'd never considered fatherhood, never thought himself capable of the patience and love that role required. But watching Maya's easy affection with her daughter, experiencing Arya's unconditional acceptance, he wondered if perhaps he'd been wrong about many things. After dinner, they watched holiday movies on Maya's modest television, Arya insisting Jinsu sit between her and her mother, treating him like an oversized teddy bear she could cuddle during exciting scenes. When Arya finally fell asleep halfway through the second movie, Jinsu carefully carried her to bed at Maya's direction, marveling at how small and fragile she felt in his arms. He'd held weapons that could end lives but never a sleeping child who represented pure innocence and trust. Back in the living room, Maya poured them both wine, and they settled on the couch with comfortable silence wrapping around them. She thanked him for everything: the medication money, the gifts, his presence on a day he could have spent anywhere else. Jinsu found himself being honest in ways he never allowed, admitting this was the best Christmas he'd experienced in 20 years, that her daughter's simple invitation had given him something he didn't know he'd been missing. Maya studied his face and quietly observed that he wasn't what she'd expected, that the cold businessman she'd imagined bore no resemblance to the man who'd spent Christmas making memories with her daughter. When Jinsu left that night, Maya walked him to the door and asked if he'd like to come back for New Year's Eve. He agreed without hesitation, already knowing that these two people had fundamentally altered his understanding of what mattered. Driving home through empty streets, Jinsu realized that for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't feel alone. Somehow, a waitress and her daughter had accomplished what wealth and power never could. They'd made him feel human again, made him believe that perhaps redemption was possible after all. Tomorrow would bring the same empire, the same obligations, the same complicated life he'd constructed. But now there was something else too: connection, purpose, the beginning of family he'd thought forever beyond his reach. The penthouse felt even emptier when he returned, highlighting everything it lacked that Maya's modest apartment possessed. Jinsu poured whiskey he didn't want and stared out at Chicago's glittering skyline, already counting hours until he could return to the South Side, to the place that had started feeling remarkably like home. Exactly 1 year had passed since that first Christmas invitation changed everything. Jinsu stood in the kitchen of the home he now shared with Maya and Arya, not his old penthouse, but a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood with a backyard where Arya could play. The transition hadn't been easy. Restructuring his business operations toward legitimate enterprises had cost him relationships and required careful navigation of dangerous waters. Some associates had left, unable to accept what they saw as weakness. Others had stayed, recognizing that Jinsu remained formidable but now had something worth protecting. There had been threats, confrontations, and one terrifying incident where rivals had attempted to use his new family against him. But Jinsu had handled each challenge with the same ruthless efficiency that had built his empire, making it abundantly clear that Maya and Arya were untouchable. The message had been received. Now, as he prepared Korean dishes alongside Maya's soul food for their Christmas Eve celebration, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The loneliness that had consumed him seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the beautiful chaos of family life. Maya moved through their kitchen with easy familiarity, occasionally bumping his hip with hers in playful affection. She wore the engagement ring he'd presented 3 months ago. Simple, elegant, exactly her style. They would marry in the spring, a small ceremony with only the people who truly mattered. His sister had reconciled with him after he'd reached out, tentatively rebuilding bridges he'd thought permanently burned. She would attend the wedding with her family, finally meeting the woman and child who had accomplished what years of estrangement couldn't, bringing her brother back to humanity. Maya's mother had flown in from Atlanta yesterday, initially suspicious of her daughter dating a reformed criminal but won over by Jinsu's obvious devotion and Arya's enthusiastic endorsements. The older woman was currently in the living room with Arya, helping decorate cookies and spoiling her granddaughter with the shameless favoritism that grandmothers everywhere employed. Laughter drifted from that direction, the sound of family creating memories that would last lifetimes. Jinsu paused in his cooking to simply listen, absorbing the warmth and joy that now filled his days. The doorbell rang, and Arya's excited shriek announced the arrival of more guests. Jinsu had invited several of his remaining business associates and their families, wanting to share this celebration with the few who had supported his transformation. Maya had invited friends from the restaurant and neighbors who had become extended family. The house filled with voices and laughter, children running through rooms while adults gathered in clusters, sharing food and stories. Jinsu found himself moving through the crowd with Maya's hand in his, introducing people from vastly different worlds who were finding common ground in shared celebration. His lieutenant approached with his wife and young son, thanking Jinsu for the invitation with genuine warmth that transcended their professional relationship. A server from the restaurant brought homemade pie, hugging Maya with the fierce affection of true friendship. Arya dragged various adults to see her room, showing off art projects and treasures with equal enthusiasm to business executives and working-class neighbors. The barriers of wealth and status dissolved in the face of genuine hospitality and shared joy. As midnight approached and the crowd counted down to Christmas, Jinsu found himself standing with Maya and Arya, surrounded by chosen family in every direction. Arya bounced with excitement, her new dress twirling as she spun in circles, completely secure in the love surrounding her. Maya leaned against Jinsu's side, her head resting on his shoulder with comfortable intimacy that still amazed him after a year together. When the countdown reached 0 and everyone shouted Merry Christmas, Arya threw her arms around both of them, declaring this the best Christmas ever, though she said that every year now, and somehow it was always true. Jinsu looked around at faces illuminated by tree lights and genuine happiness, at the home they'd built together, at the family he'd never thought possible. A year ago he'd been alone in a sterile penthouse, convinced that isolation was his permanent condition, that the empire he'd built was all he would ever have. Then a 7-year-old girl had invited a lonely stranger to Christmas dinner, and everything had changed. Jinsu pulled Maya closer and kissed the top of Arya's head, overwhelmed by gratitude for the mercy of second chances. His past would always be complicated, his journey toward redemption ongoing rather than complete. But standing here surrounded by love freely given and family deliberately chosen, he understood something fundamental about human existence. Wealth and power were empty substitutes for connection. Success measured only in financial terms was actually failure in the metrics that truly mattered. And sometimes salvation came not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through the simple invitation of a child who believed nobody should be lonely on Christmas. The empire he'd built still existed, but it no longer defined him. These people, this woman who'd shown him patience and acceptance, this child who'd taught him unconditional love, this chosen family who'd embraced him despite everything, they were his true wealth now. As the celebration continued around them and snow began falling outside their windows, Jinsa silently thanked whatever benevolent force had placed him in that restaurant exactly 1 year ago, had given him the wisdom to accept an unexpected invitation, had offered him this extraordinary gift of belonging. He was home. Finally, completely, eternally home.